listener production.
Hey, Chris Spyrou with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Have you ever had to dodge a swooping magpie or a stray cricket ball? Well, what about a flaming hot piece of metal falling from the sky?
For the longest time, we just said, all right, stuff is going to go up and it's going to come back down, and most of the earth is uninhabited. It'll be all right. It'll be fine. The problem is there's so many things now going up and so many things coming back down. That argument is quite poor.
That deep dive into the multi-agency probe that's underway after suspected space junk slammed into regional WA, where it came from, and the odds of something like it ever winding up in your backyard is coming up in the second half of this episode. First, though, let's get into the headlines with Helen Smith. It's Thursday, the 23rd of October.
Hey Chris, and to you listening, we're starting in the Middle East, where an Australian official is set to join Donald Trump's Gaza Peace Task Force, as the International Court of Justice tells Israel it must allow UN aid to be distributed to the Strip. The United Nations top court delivered the advisory opinion this morning, which is not binding, saying Israel is obliged to make sure the basic needs of Palestinians are met by supporting its relief efforts.
Those relief efforts include those of its Palestinian aid agency UNRWA, which Israel has effectively banned from operating in the region, accusing it of lacking neutrality and being infiltrated by Hamas. Claims that UNRWA has denied and claims the ICJ says Israel has not provided real proof for. The Netanyahu government has this morning rejected the opinion of the 11 judges, saying it's political, insisting it will not cooperate with UNRWA. It is important to note, though, that since the ceasefire began earlier this month, aid has started flowing back into Gaza through other agencies. Israel briefly paused it last week over alleged Hamas violations, but deliveries have since resumed. However, the UN's World Food Programme says only 750 of the 2,000 daily tonnes are actually getting through at the moment.
Meanwhile, the Australian government confirmed yesterday that a liaison officer from the Australian Defence Force will be taking part in the US-run Civil Military Coordination Centre, which is a key part of Donald Trump's 20-point peace plan. It involves representatives from several countries, including Australia, with the ADF officer likely to be involved in the planning and coordination of aid, security and reconstruction efforts.
Back home now, where two men have died in rough waters in Melbourne south as Victoria was lashed with wild weather. Emergency services were called to Port Phillip at around 5 p.m. yesterday, where the men were found unresponsive just off Frankston Beach. They were taken ashore but could not be revived, with Frankston Mayor Chris Bolam issuing a statement last night extending his sympathies to the men's families and saying it appeared they'd been swept off a pier.
The drownings happened while most of Victoria was under a severe weather warning, with some parts experiencing winds of up to 130 kilometres per hour.
We certainly have seen some really strong winds and hazardous conditions across the state today. Our volunteers have been responding to over 600 requests for assistance today. Over half of those have been for tree-related jobs, whether that be trees down over roads, on properties or in public areas.
That was Jeb Abbott from the SES there. Now, the winds caused widespread destruction, knocked out power for nearly 14,000 customers, caused dust storms and actually led to the Geelong Cup being called off, with punters evacuated from marquees after 3 races.
So disappointing, and they knew that this was coming yesterday. Why didn't someone call it before?
Meantime, New South Wales was also battered by gale force winds as parts of Sydney reached 40 degrees yesterday.
It's about a third or fourth day of near record heat for inland parts of southern and western Queensland and also northern and eastern parts of New South Wales.
That was Dean Narramore from The Bomb there. Multiple weather records were broken in Western Sydney yesterday after a mass of hot, dry air from inland Australia swept in, but cooler temperatures and calmer winds have already kicked in, which New South Wales fireys are welcoming as they continue to battle multiple blazes that broke out.
Telstra has revealed that more than 70 models of Samsung mobile phones may be unable to call 000 in the event of an emergency because of connectivity issues. The telco tested the models over the last couple of weeks, finding 11 older models of Samsung Galaxy phones were impacted, meaning users would need to replace them with newer devices. It also says that around 60 other Samsung models required system updates in order to work effectively, and that customers would be notified via email or SMS.
Yeah, and Telstra's been warning affected customers that those with these older models would be blocked from its network if their phones were not replaced within 28 days of being notified. And that's because of the government's emergency service call regulations, which requires all mobile mobile network operators to do just that if those phones cannot be configured to access things like 000.
Meanwhile, Optus has also announced it's begun contacting affected customers and would begin blocking phones that were not replaced. It comes as pressure's been mounting since multiple people died last month during Optus's network outage, where over 600 customers were unable to make emergency calls.
New data has found you could be paying nearly 40% more for your groceries if you're using apps like Uber Eats, DoorDash and Milk Run. Independent consumer group Choice tested 13 common grocery items across Coles, Woolies and Aldi and found Aussies using the third-party rapid delivery apps over shopping directly online or in-store were paying the price even when factoring in a $15 delivery fee.
On average, items like pasta, milk and fresh veggies cost around 11% more, with those delivery fees adding significantly to the bill. In fact, those delivery fees meant baskets from Woolworths and Coles cost 39% and 35% more than purchases made in store, while products cost 12% more.
Uber Eats was the most expensive platform overall, with all products from Coles costing more on Uber Eats and DoorDash. As for Aldi, 7 out of 13 items were priced higher on DoorDash than they were in store, and Woolies customers were charged more for 11 out of the 13 items when using Milk Run. Now, this is coming so late in the piece, but Dad, if you're listening, please block your ears and pretend we never brought this news to you this morning.
Have you ever poured out the rest of your drink on the street or maybe even in a bush? Well, next time you do, maybe think twice, because a woman in London was fined £150 or $300 Australian for pouring the rest of her morning coffee down a street drain before jumping on the bus. And to her surprise, the next thing she knew, 3 enforcement officers were chasing after her, telling the woman that she was in breach of their Environmental Protection Act.
Which meant her leftover coffee down the drain was actually an offence, because it's an offence to dispose of waste in a way that could pollute land or water. Now, thankfully, the penalty has been revoked after a council review. And if you were wondering if similar legislation exists in Australia, it does. It exists in multiple states and territories because it is connected to, like I just mentioned, water pollution as well as illegal dumping. Now, enforcement is incredibly rare in Australia, but fines do vary, and they can vary from $200 all the way up to $5,000. Now, it'd be very interesting to see if anyone listening has ever been charged with this offence. And actually, we do want to know if something like this has happened to you or someone you know. What is the weirdest fine you've copped or a mate has copped? We're going to pop a broadcast channel prompt up. Just head to our Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. Now, that is it for our headlines for today. Coming up next is my deep dive looking into the world of space junk. Now, we think space junk has fallen in WA. Where did it come from? What are the next steps? And who could be to blame? Stick around. That deep dive is coming up for you next. How much time do you spend thinking about space?
Space, the final frontier.
What about all the things that chill up there? I'm not talking about aliens, silly, but the tens of thousands of tons of metal we've sent up there. Everything from rockets to satellites and whole space stations. And have you ever thought maybe, just maybe, you could be
bopped on the head by a tiny piece of space debris?
Well, it's something you might want to start thinking about, especially after a piece of suspected space junk came crashing down in remote Western Australia. Brad Tucker is an astrophysicist from the Australian National University, and he joins me now. Brad, welcome back to The Briefing. What can you tell us about that burning object miners found in WA's Pilbara region over the weekend?
Yeah, so it appears to be a piece of space junk. And when we say space junk, we mean debris from an object that was in space. So it could be fragmented, it could have gone up and came down, it could have broken apart. So there's a variety of ways we define space junk. This appears to be part of a rocket booster, the one of the top parts. So rockets have different stages or parts. So this kind of is the last part that gives it the push into space, the satellite, and came back down and happened to re-enter and burn up, or kind of burn up, and land on a road out to the mine in the Pilbara there.
How does something like this survive a fiery plunge back down to Earth?
So with rocket components, you have to build something that's fairly lightweight, relatively speaking, but also survive literally a controlled explosion, right? That's what a rocket is, a controlled explosion. So you have to build something super reinforced and strong, lightweight, and to withstand the natural rocket pressure and speeds and energy and heat that comes out of it. So that means when it does the reverse and comes back down, you've built something hardy. And so the idea is that in theory, these things should land in the ocean when they do come back down, so it doesn't land on land or people. The problem is there's so many of them. And with this thing, it's what we call uncontrolled debris. So we have stuff that is controlled where we can deliberately steer it down and kind of nosedive it in a certain spot. And then the stuff that just falls down under its own devices and can kind of come down anywhere, anytime. So it has to go into orbit in order to deploy the satellite. But that means that once its job is done, there's no fuel, there's nothing left, and it's discarded rubbish. So it just gets stuck in an uncontrolled manner, just randomly orbiting the Earth at 25 or so thousand kilometers an hour, and then eventually slowly spirals back to the Earth.
So WA police say that they're coordinating a multi-agency response at the moment. Which agencies does that typically involve, and what do they do?
So the Australian Space Agency is the group that is responsible for things. And so they have the process of reporting back to international partners on space junk and space debris. And it becomes quite a complicated international treaty space obligation. So there's somewhat a duty in place by the group that the object lands in to return it. But then there's also if there's any damages and cleanup and effort caused, and this has happened quite a bit. So it kind of rests with the Australian Space Agency, and then they work with their counterparts in the other countries. So in the US, for instance, this is the FAA. A lot of people think it's NASA, it's the FAA. And then there's a Chinese national government in this case, assuming it is from a Chinese rocket, which we think it is, that they'll have to go back to.
When we're talking about space junk or debris more broadly, how do we know what's out there? How are we able to track and monitor these things that are just orbiting above us at all times?
Things that have their own control have power and then usually report where they are, kind of through ground stations and those sorts of things. Uncontrolled debris, which kind of has lost its own power, if it's big enough, you can track it by radar. So the U.S. Space Force does a lot of tracking of large objects. And so this object was tracked by the U.S. Space Force. So anything about 15 centimeters or larger, you can bounce radar signals off of and come back down to Earth and track it. So in this case, you can track it via the radar. You need multiple stations around the world to constantly track things. So this is part of the problem. There are private companies doing this more and more now. Then you get to the smaller issues, because in this case, the big pieces land back down. We also have the worry of small bits in orbit, because there's a ton of small bits out there as well. We think there's anywhere between 30 and 50, 60, 70,000 pieces, large pieces out there. Pieces bigger than centimeter-ish scale, we're talking about hundreds of thousands. Now, that may not seem like a big deal, but a centimeter scale object traveling 25,000 kilometers an hour will still destroy your satellite. That becomes really tricky to find those things. So there's a lot of work done in Australia using lasers to track them. But overall, the problem is there's no one real group responsible for this. There's not really legislated based on the way we send things into space that you have to do this. So it's up to kind of individual groups or companies or countries to bear the responsibility of doing it.
Yeah, and look, I'll be honest with you, when I saw this story popping up over the weekend, my immediate thought was, oh gosh, how likely is it that I could just be walking out one day and a bit of space junk falls in front of me? How often or how likely is it for a person to be injured by something like space debris?
Look, yeah, I wouldn't lose sleep over it, right? It's not going to happen anytime soon. The risk and the problem is, for the longest time, we just said, all right, stuff is going to go up and it's going to come back down. And most of the Earth is uninhabited. 70% or so is the oceans. Even the parts that are land, there's no one there. So we kind of just always said, it'll be all right. It'll be fine. The problem is there's so many things now going up and so many things coming back down. That argument is quite poor. SpaceX's Starlink satellite constellation alone has 2 satellites or so re-entering every day. Now, those are designed to pretty much mostly break apart, and they're controlled, so they kind of come down in a very discrete point. Not always the case. There's a lot more. I mean, we are talking about multiple pieces per day coming back down. Now, the risk to any one person or property is very, very low. You have to be really unlucky, so to speak, to have that happen. But overall, in terms of that consequence, that is becoming the problem of more and more of these things coming down, more and more of these things potentially crashing, and more of these things posing a risk, not necessarily to people, but property as well.
And look, a little note for listeners, there have been no recorded injuries from falling space debris in Australia to date.
Exactly.
So I am curious to know, though, what are some of the other potential harms associated with space debris, aside from, the very long shot of being bopped on the head or it destroying some of your property? What are some of the associated risks here?
Some of the material can be quite corrosive. So, rocket fuel is generally not a nice substance, and it's designed to burn really well. It could be corrosive. It could be carcinogenic. So there's certain types of fuel that are really bad for humans. Carbon fiber itself, when it singes and burns, so a lot of this material is carbon fiber because of its strength and lightweight. If there's burnt, singed fibers, it can get into the lungs if you touch or get near it and kind of create something almost like mesothelioma. There's the environmental risk. Right? You're still talking about, even if this goes according to plan and doesn't land on someone or something and lands in the ocean, you're still polluting and ending this junk in the ocean. And then there are the risks actually in space. This stuff uncontrolled actually crashing into other things. And then you have two objects crashing at over 20,000 kilometers an hour each. The wreckage is huge, producing thousands of pieces of debris. This then propagates to create even more problems. So space junk overall is a really big problem. I think I like to describe it as kind of what we talk about microplastics. We talk a lot about microplastics and, hey, we're now trying to deal with the world we've created. Space junk is that similar problem, but luckily there are simple ways in terms of policy, regulation, and design to limit and control and then turn back, so to speak, the issues of space junk.
In the instance that someone, let's just say, does get injured or something happens to someone else's property while in space or while on Earth, who's liable?
Yeah, and there's a couple of things, and it's a little bit like a car accident. Firstly, you have to prove who's at fault. Now, in this case, all right, okay, it's the rocket, it's at fault, but who does that belong to? They don't usually have nice big flags for every part, and most of it's burnt. Not all of them, and very rarely do they have part numbers. There was an incident of space junk landing in New South Wales 3 years ago, and there were part numbers, and you could identify it as belonging to SpaceX. In this case, everyone's worked out that it's most likely belongs to the Geelong 3 rocket, which is a Chinese rocket. But you have to prove without a doubt it does belong to that country, and then therefore what group. And they kind of have to claim responsibility. So there's always the air of, well, actually, it's not mine. And so there's a lot of this pinpointing of that. And then you have to deal with the legal ramifications, again, if something is endangered. So let's imagine it lands and it destroys a house or, destroys a shed or something like that, lands on a car. No one's injured. Okay, that's great. So who's responsible for that damage? Well, it's actually up to the Australian Space Agency somewhat to decide, because it's an international treaty. And if the Australian Space Agency says, yes, okay, great, but then the other country could still say, no, we don't accept liability. And then it kind of gets taken almost to an international court level. But then the question is it worth it, right? You're talking about huge international conflicts potentially for that. And then in the case of if the Australian Space Agency says we're not going to go pursue damages, well, then the end user or person afflicted in this has to decide what they want to do. Are you actually going to pursue damages to the Australian government? It becomes really complicated in a lot of ways. And it's not because it's complicated for complicated sake, but space is governed in the international realm. And then at some level you have to, you do want international control and cooperation of this. But we now live in a world where these issues are interacting with the average public and more people day to day. And so that world is changing, so to speak.
Brad, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Take care.
That was astrophysicist Dr. Brad Tucker from the Australian National University speaking with me there. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing. If you enjoyed it or learned something new, why not flick it over to a mate? And while you're there, leave us a rate and a review. I'm Spyrou. I'll catch you next time.